So I'm going to talk to you about a specific thing, namely climate change, but I actually want to end up with talking about all the big issues in the world. And I'm going to tell you a somewhat different story on climate change that you're probably used to, which will probably cause some of you to at least be a little, what? And of course, that also means it's incredibly important that we have the Q&A at the end. I'm going to give you a tsunami of data. I'm a statistician. I think data is sexy, right? So that means I'm going to show you a lot of graphs. I'm going to go through it. Because I'm basically going to do the whole global warming thing and everything else in 40 minutes. I'm sorry, it's probably going to be a little fast. But again, I want to make sure that we have good time for Q&A. And I'm also around for the whole week. So please feel free to come up and talk afterwards. So fundamentally, global warming is a real thing. It's a problem. It'll have significant and negative impact in the long run. But just to give you a sense of proportion, and I think this is one of the places where economics can help us understand what is the total impact of global warming right now if you translate all of the impacts into monetary terms. Turns out that it's about 0 right now. And by the 2070s, the impact will be somewhere between 0.2 and 2% of GDP. And most of you are probably like, what? That can't be true. This is actually what the UN climate panel, the IPCC, is telling us. I'm going to show you mostly just the very official data, the ones that we have from the UN climate panel and other very official sources. So this is not something that is totally outside the standard. This is simply the kind of conversation that we often forget because global warming, like many other things, are mostly impacted by their scare value or their news value or their clickbait value. So this is a graph that was done for the UN Climate Panel's latest report. It's been updated by Nordhaus, who just got the Nobel Prize in economics and climate economics. He's the first economist of climate economists to get a Nobel Prize. So this is all the studies that we have from everywhere looking at. If you take the temperature, and again, for you guys who are in Fahrenheit, I'm sorry, climate is always in centigrades, but it doesn't really matter. Multiply by 2 and you kind of have Fahrenheit. And up here you have the impact in GDP. So the further down, the higher the cost. And what you basically see is it's about 0 up here to about 2 degrees. We expect we'll probably get to about 4 degrees by the end of the century, and that's where you see probably damage is somewhere between 3–4% of GDP. And as you can see right now, where we're at 1 degree, there's one evidence that actually indicates it's a net benefit for the world. There's a couple of impacts that show that it's a slight disbenefit, so around 0. I want to spend the first part of the conversation to tell you why is this actually true. I mean, this is what the UN climate panel is telling us, but why is this true when we hear such different stories that this is the end of the world, the apocalypse is nigh? Well, to a very large extent, that's because global warming is typically terribly exaggerated. Now, that's for a lot of reasons. Obviously, somebody is trying to get funding, but also lots and lots of newspapers and everything else depends on you clicking on their stuff. And one of the best ways to get you to do that is to make it more exciting than the last story you read. I'm going to show you a few of those. Al Gore is obviously one. It's like nature hike through the book of Revelations on the news every day now is what he tells you. We're seeing with climate change, perhaps a more sort of moderate voice is Obama, who told you that we're seeing more extreme droughts, floods, wildfires, and hurricanes. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to look at droughts and floods and hurricanes just to go through very quickly. And obviously, I could also talk about wildfires when we get to the Q&A. But let me just show you the difference between what you hear and what the data actually tells us. So, for instance, in droughts, we have this idea that we're seeing more and more droughts. Droughts are getting more and more terrible around the world. Well, actually, if you look at the data, we've seen a decline in drought over the last 100 years. these are the data that we have. This is the latest report that we have on drought. And this is indeed also the US climate change science program, so the one that has been repeatedly been doing these climate reports. The last one was the one that sort of came out and told that Trump is all wrong about global warming. They say droughts have, for the most part, become shorter, less frequent, and cover a smaller proportion of the US over the last century. A very, very different sense of what we normally expect. And the simple point is, of course, as temperatures rise, we're going to see more moisture in the atmosphere. We're going to see more rain. That's actually going to be somewhat of a problem. But it's, of course, also one of the reasons why we're actually likely to see less drought. So the UN Climate Panel, the IPCC, says there's low confidence in a global scale observed trend in drought. They say we cannot see that it has increased. Notice they can't say that it's decreased either. The one that I showed you before is the best estimate, is the trend line, but it's not significant. For the future, and this is true for most things, we expect that at least for some places, the future will get worse with global warming. That's why at the end of the century, global warming will have an impact of about 3–4% of GDP. That's a problem, but it's not the end of the world. And that's the conversation that I really want to get us into, because if we can start talking about this as a problem instead of end of the world, we can also start having a rational conversation about, so what should we do about it? So they tell us there's medium confidence that droughts will intensify in some seasons and areas, overall low confidence elsewhere. So again, we'll see this pattern repeated. There is no good evidence for the kind of things that you're being told right now, that things are getting totally out of hand, but there is evidence that things are probably going to get somewhat worse in the future. If you take a look equally on flooding, well, the UN Climate Panel actually tells us we don't even know if it's getting worse or getting better. There's a lack of evidence and low confidence in regarding the sign of trend in the magnitude and/or frequency of floods on a global scale of the instrumental record. We just simply don't know. Well, if you actually look at the cost, and of course this is one of the things that economists will continue to point out, that even if there is a problem, if you're also getting richer, you're typically much better able to handle that problem. So what we see is, as people get richer, you actually have a lower impact in percent of your GDP. So if you look at US data, we have US data back from 1903. Again, I often show you US data just simply because we have the best data from there. If you take the cost of flooding in percent of GDP, you've seen a dramatic decline in the cost of US flooding. Most of that is not because there's much less flooding. Actually, we have a hard time seeing if there's an increase or a decrease, but it is the fact that the US, because it's become much richer, has become much less vulnerable to flooding. And that's, of course, one of the important parts, because if you then want to fix the issues of global warming, the impacts of future global warming, you've got to ask yourself, might it be true that the best way to do that is to make sure that people get richer so that they get less vulnerable? If you look at hurricanes, the last thing that we see, if you remember, The Inconvenient Truth actually had its poster was the Katrina hurricane coming out of a smokestack. It was a very potent image, this idea of saying global warming is simply damaging everybody you care for and love for, and it's going to flood us all and rip through your home. But the honest answer is, again, the UN Climate Panel tells us there's low confidence in attribution of changes in tropical cyclone activity, that's what they call hurricanes in the scientific language, to human influence. And in the future, we expect that there will probably be fewer, but probably stronger hurricanes. So again, actually not more, fewer, but probably stronger hurricanes. Overall, that'll probably mean that it will be worse. But again, let's get a sense of proportion. Right now, and this is from a famous study in Nature, we estimate that all hurricanes have an impact of about 0.04% of global GDP. So remember, this is not a big issue. It's certainly a big issue for the people and the places that are hit by hurricanes, but globally, this is a fairly small issue. If there was no global warming, so you simply run the model, but you do it without global warming. So you just look at what happens when people get much richer and you have the same sort of hurricanes as you have today. The impact is you then see a decline in cost down to 0.01% of GDP. Why? Because if you're richer, you're more resilient, and hurricanes will harm you less. It's simply the fact of a hurricane that hits Florida, causes a lot of damage, but very few people die, and it quickly springs back. If the same sort of hurricane hits Guatemala, it can impact like a third of its GDP, and it can devastate it for years and possibly even a decade. What happens if you then put in global warming? Well, they did exactly that, and what they find is then you see a doubling of the impact. So global warming will actually make it much, much worse. It'll go from 0.01 to 0.02% of GDP. But also notice what will happen is that we've actually seen a decline from 0.04 today down to 0.02% of GDP. And this is the complicated message. Of course, this is the reason why this point that I make, and actually the points that the UN Climate Panel is making, is not making it on the news, but whereas it's very, very easy to say, oh my God, we're all going to die. We're going to see double the impact of hurricanes by the end of the century. That's technically true, but it's double of half of it, right? So it's actually 0.04 down to 0.02, and it's also just 0.02% of GDP. This is not what's going to drive us to the poorhouse. This is a problem. We'd rather have 0.01 than 0.02, but it is just a fairly small problem. This is the point that I want to try to say, look, the data doesn't confirm this. Also, if you look at the continental landfalling hurricanes for the US, we've actually seen a decline both of all hurricanes since 1900, and we've also seen a decline in the strong hurricanes hitting the US. As you might see, we had the longest desert of hurricanes from 2006 to 2017, where there are no strong hurricanes hitting the US. Again, the point here is to recognize that while there is a problem with global warming, it's vastly exaggerated, and that makes it hard for us to make good policy.